I'm Carl King, and this is The Carl King Show, where every week we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chewbode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Toontrack, and Millennium Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, you might notice that this is an audio-only episode. And that's because I had to take an unexpected trip to Florida last week, but I promise I brought a dang good episode back with me, because today we will be joined by Chewbode. But first, I have an important announcement. Some of you might remember the Sir Millard Mulch cover of Come Sail Away on the How to Sell album. Well, the lead vocals on that were performed by my very good friend from music college, Dale Lewis. Turns out Dale is suffering from some serious health problems, and that's why I went to Florida, and we are doing a GoFundMe to get him a mobility scooter. He has devoted his life to helping others, and now he needs our help. So if you can spare a few bucks, I am putting a GoFundMe link in the show notes. Thank you for anything you can give. And now, let's move on to this week's episodic episode of the week with Chewbode. What the heck is a Chewbode, you ask? Well, according to Urban Dictionary, it's a style of bed and breakfast where you can actually eat the bed for breakfast. And in some countries, it's actually hot dog flavored. But it's also the name of my longest-term friend and creative collaborator. In one way or another, Chewbode has been involved in everything I've made when I've gone by Carl King, Sir Millard Mulch, and Dr. Zoltan, as far back as designing the cassette J-card for my very first demo tape, all the way through to story editing my latest animated pilot. In this multi-episode chat with Chewbode, we tell the story of our 33-year friendship, from riding the school bus as teenagers, all the way to dressing up in business suits and trying to sell a fake invention in New York City. This is the story of two smart, creative kids who met in the swamps of South Venice, Florida, and made plans to escape. Part 1 begins now. All right, I'm here with Chewbode. Say hello, Mr. Chewbode.
Hello, Mr. Chewbode.
Let's go back to how we first met. I think it was in 1990. I was, I believe, 15 years old in 10th grade. That was the same year as Desert Storm, and also Steve Vai's Passion and Warfare record. The first time I went to your house, your parents' house, where you lived with your parents because we were kids, from what I recall, you were trying to beam an image into space as some sort of science experiment. And I remember being very confused and shocked that this kid was doing this, and you had all these electronics in your bedroom wired together in some weird way. Can you explain what the heck you were doing?
Yeah, well, maybe not, but I'll try. Being a person that learned using computers when computers were very basic in their infancy, there was a natural tendency for me to kind of get to understand things like capacitors and circuit boards and things like that. And I was no expert, obviously. It was just a tinkering around with stuff, but I kind of got it. And that led me down the road of like tearing other stuff apart eventually, including quote unquote bad television sets that I would stumble across. And
in your mom's living room or whatever. Like
right.
Well, I guess the TV's not working anymore.
Right, yeah. And so at the time, I had a couple of these TVs that had stripped down, and there was just the tube and like the electron gun. which painted the picture onto the screen. For those of you that out there that know that, these devices, these electron guns that are in the back of a television are super high voltage, and they can kill you if you're not careful. Huge capacitors storing a huge amount of energy. And, you do the wrong thing, you short something out with a screwdriver, you're toast, right? Luckily I know what I'm kind of doing and I'm being careful.
But you were how old? You're like 16.
But yeah, I think it was around 16 or so. There was a way you could actually essentially make like this high-powered like laser device by retuning this electron gun that's back there and have it kind of point in a different direction. And it required like removing this big coil of wire and like repositioning it. I had that physically working, and it would actually burn holes in like balloons and pop them and stuff. And I actually was using technically sheets of paper, literally set the smoke alarm off a couple times. I got in trouble for that. My parents were not very happy with that. But what you remember kind of seeing was there was a project at one point where someone surmised the viability of taking an image and shining it from the outside world into the TV screen and having the electron gun that normally creates the image read the image. So it's in a way kind of like a Xerox machine where there's a glass piece that is reading an image, and you could then transmit it out the back side if you had rebuilt the back end, which I kind of had done this.
Basically just using a TV backwards.
Kind of using a TV backwards. But the beauty was you were transmitting.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to say, I have no idea if this broke any FCC laws or anything, or how bad this was an idea. I was a kid, really, and I was just having fun learning this stuff. No one ever knocked on my door, but probably was not a healthy thing to be playing with all this stuff. But I really learned a lot, and it got me really interested. And the fundamental takeaway of all this is I was always the kind of kid that didn't just take a television apart to learn how the knobs in a TV worked, but I said, what the heck else can we convert this into? Out of the box kind of fun thinking, like things that hopefully no one else had ever thought of before.
Now, the reason we met is when we were in high school, we were some of the only kids in town who had computers. In like 1990, in the pre-internet days, there were these things called BBSs, which stood for bulletin board systems. And they were a way for nerdy kids like us to use our old-fashioned telephones to dial into various computers and meet each other and post messages. But it wasn't a thing that normal, everyday people did. It was like using computers for this was kind of a secret subculture. So I needed some of those secret phone numbers to dial, and I was told that, oh, he's the guy to talk to.
Yeah, it was kind of like a speakeasy password, right? It's like you didn't get to know these things unless you knew somebody that knew these phone numbers. They weren't published really anywhere. If you were lucky, you'd dial into a BBS, and it would be nice enough to publish other people's BBS numbers for you. But typically it was hey, I got a buddy that knows these three numbers, jot them down and see if you can connect to these systems and see how cool they are. And that's kind of how word got about. You and I interacted that way, and I gave you off some numbers so that you could do some calling around and see what was out there.
So the cool thing was that kind of primitive computer technology gave us an escape from that isolated backwoods environment that we were stuck in. And it turned out that we realized, oh, we actually live right by each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we were probably, I think, maybe about a third of a mile or so from each other. It was definitely like tolerable walking distance in Florida.
Right.
It wasn't pleasant to walk that far, but we became friends, and we lived in South Venice, Florida.
Yep.
Now, South Venice, it was pretty jungly, and it still is. It's near this thing called Alligator Creek, and Chewbode and I lived on opposite sides of Alligator Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And Alligator Creek had a small bridge going across it that you could walk across, and the bridge was pretty small, maybe like 2 car lengths long or 3 car lengths.
Mm-hmm.
You'd walk over this bridge, and there was water underneath it, and there were alligators in it. It was very muddy. So if you imagine living in Florida, you might think, oh, like beautiful beaches and stuff. This was very, very dark water, lots of mud, insects.
You wouldn't want to go in that water.
No, you don't want to be thrown in that water. You don't want to end up in there. It was very dark brown, muddy, disgusting water. South Venice was very uncivilized back then. There were a lot of empty lots, and there still are, but there were, original palmettos and pine trees, and it was just basically like jungle.
Yeah.
A lot of it just had not been developed. It's just lots full of weeds and trees and vines hanging all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of raccoons and possums.
Yeah.
So this was kind of like the country in some ways.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note too that this area was very close to the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes,
from the beach
it was
and water.
Actually.
Yes,
like as the crow flies, or what is that?
Yeah,
like it's actually
like a mile, maybe.
It was even closer than that. I think lots of sweat, lots of bugs and lots of sweating.
Yeah.
There's no sidewalks in our neighborhood.
Oh yeah,
you just basically walk either on the street or you walk in the weeds on the side of the street.
Right.
We were kind of far from civilization, almost like in a swamp.
Right.
And it was basically super old people who never left their houses, or redneck types. And to get to the nearest store, we had to walk about a mile to the farm store where you could get like a Mountain Dew or some Slim Jims. And then you'd have to walk a mile back. And it was pretty crappy to walk that far in Florida. So you don't see too many people walking in Florida unless they've got problems or financial difficulties that force them to be walking.
With all of the, overgrownness and, issues with storms from time to time, washing things out, you're walking in the street, going from, like I'd go to your house and I'd walk in the street and sometimes I'd have a book bag or some piece of...
I remember you would carry a computer monitor with
stuff
you.
like that.
A big, what is it called? A CRT?
Yeah.
Giant CRT monitor with you.
Yep. And so I'd be, carry those kinds of things down the street and I'd round the corner and there's the bridge. And, the bridge is actually kind of the strange cattywampus kind of way it's designed. So there's like blind corners walking to it. So you're just praying this car doesn't come around the corner and kill you, or an alligator comes out of that muck and tries to chase you or whatever. So, it wasn't super, super dangerous, but this was just a lack of infrastructure and kind of how messy it was. And no one cared because who the heck should be walking outside anyway? Because it's so hot and sweaty.
Yeah,
so.
You just don't expect anybody to be out there walking on the bridge. So when you speed around the corner, it's like, whoa, there's somebody there.
Exactly.
We came from kind of the middle of nowhere, and there wasn't much art or culture around us. And it was kind of like a depressed, low-energy small town. I don't think there was much future for us unless we just invented it ourselves. And that's kind of what we did. Yeah. We were just forced to invent a future.
Yeah.
Because I don't think there was a clear path forward for creative kids like us.
No. And I think that the town in general was just kind of anti-kids. When you guys, were putting bands together and going out and playing gigs and stuff locally, I would go out there and I would see how people would just be like, absolutely don't want these kids playing in this venue. And
well, there really were no venues. It was either
that too.
It was like you're playing in a backyard or something, or whatever.
And of course, they're going to call the cops because it's too noisy or whatever. So it wasn't friendly to the youth from that perspective, which made it even kind of more depressing that you kind of had to look inward instead of trying to get the community to get behind you and you get involved in some sort of great system of activities locally. Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. You had to make it happen yourself.
Exactly. I mean, the options were pretty bleak, and if we didn't somehow go to college, it was either working at Walmart or a gas station or washing dishes. There was no fine arts community that was welcoming us in. There was no guidance like, hey, smart creative kid, we've got a place for you to fit in. And our parents and teachers pretty much had no idea what to do with us. So if I were to ask 16-year-old Chewbode, what do you want to do with your life? What do you think you would have said back then?
Wow. Great question. When I was in school in Michigan, I had taken a bunch of courses in my freshman year of high school, and I kind of wanted to be a surgeon, actually, believe it or not. That was something that it was interesting to me. It was a technical thing. I've kind of my mind kind of leans towards technical things with spurts of creativity.
But I can also see why you'd be interested in surgery, because you're like into looking at micro
like little microcosms of things.
Microcosms, yeah. That's the term you use. You like models and tiny little shrunken down things with like
exactly, yeah. And so that was something that I thought, when I was a kid, it was kind of something I toyed with ever since I was ever since I was about 8 or so. I
started cutting people.
Yeah, no, I was. My dad had run a business, a cleaning business out of the home, and around that time, this was in the mid to early '80s, he had to get a computer. For those that know, old Commodore 64 we got. And I started to learn how to program on it because, my dad wasn't using the computer 24/7. So I would kind of get in there and snipe some time and goof around on it. And I started learning how to do some real rudimentary computer programming.
Can I ask real quick?
Yeah.
The reason I had to get into programming at a young age is because we didn't have any games and you had to write the game to play it on a TRS-80.
Right.
Were you doing a similar thing?
That was the door. That was the entryway into it. Yeah, my experience was to kind of understand what this crazy beige box did. Period. It made weird noises, and you'd insert discs and eject discs, and all these kinds of things. But the reality was, the only real way to kind of get stuff is either if you had the money to go buy a game, which I'm a little kid, I didn't have money to go do that, and my dad wasn't interested in turning his business computer into a gaming computer. Was, you get a magazine from a corner store, maybe a farm store or 7-Eleven even. You take it home and you open up the book and it's got like this 40, 50, maybe even 100-line program, and you sit tediously typing that into the computer, and then you hit run and it runs the game, and it doesn't last. When you turn off the power of the computer, the game goes
the game's
away.
Gone. You have to retype the video game in to make it actually work.
Yeah, so there was a lot of this repetition and learning things because of that, and it kind of helps make it stick, and that ultimately helps you appreciate, the coding, the aspect of coding. Even as a little kid, I was appreciating like, wow, this takes a long time to do. Imagine if I actually had to create the game from scratch. I just am copying it out of a book.
Right.
But so there's no brain power in that really, but it still takes forever. And I was kind of wowed by that. So the 16-year-old Chewbode has this in his back pocket where he's kind of learned stuff since he was a little kid, writing little programs and stuff like that and doing stuff. So laid out in front of me was, I'm going to try to be a surgeon, and that's what I'm going for. I moved to Florida, and they all my transcripts transfer down with me. In all the courses I had taken that were like these advanced classes and stuff in Michigan, they didn't exist in Florida because the crap hole
Florida's
that
a bunch
Florida
of dummies.
Yeah. No. Well, it was just it
just wasn't as advanced. Yeah.
It was a crappy system in comparison, right? I would take classes that were like a biology class in Michigan, and I got down here and they gave me like an algebra 1 credit because they just couldn't even tie it to something. And so I kind of got really mentally deflated on that path. And I said, all right, screw it. I really can't do this. It sounds funny now that we're older, but it seemed like it was kind of dead stop, the end of the world. Like, oh, forget it. I've tried. I can't do it. But even though it was in its infancy of me trying. And so I said, computer stuff is kind of the way I was going to go. So around that time is kind of where I was getting my mind focused on the technical stuff is really what I was hoping to do. I was like, maybe I'll get into computers. I'll be a computer programmer and get a job doing that, and corporate job or something like that. I wasn't too focused as to exactly how I was going to do it, but it was going to be with computers at that point.
Now, we rode the bus to summer school. I remember the rubber seats in those things. And
squeaked a lot.
Just be sweating really bad inside no AC. And my mom would drive the two of us up to the corner of 41 and South Venice Boulevard across from the farm store and stand around getting eaten by bugs waiting for the school bus.
Yeah.
And when we were riding the school bus one day home, that was when we came up with the name Chewbode. And I wanted to explain a little bit about how that came about. I don't want to give away the entire secret to it, but there's this idea when you're on a BBS, and this also goes for current internet, like you have a Twitter handle.
Yeah.
Well, back in the BBS days, we had handles just like that.
Or like a gamer tag.
Yeah, a gamer tag. People who use CB radios, I think, sometimes have handles and stuff like that.
Right.
So they're not identifying themselves directly. You can't go over to their house if you hear them talking.
Yeah.
The name I came up with was a certain way of scrambling the letters in my name and adding a T on the beginning, which made my name T.R. Lardkin. We were talking about that on the bus or something, giggling about it or whatever. And we took some of the letters in your name and we scrambled them up and ended up with HOTDOG, which was kind of funny. And then I think I suggested adding an L on the beginning, an L period HOTDOG, but the whole thing was kind of clunky. We're like, I don't know, it
didn't flow good.
Yeah, for some reason it doesn't seem aesthetically right. I think you started like drawing arrows and moving the letters around. Your typical thing for writing on that you'd carry with you often was graph paper. You were a very graph paper guy.
Yeah.
And because you like drawing diagrams and all that. And we shuffled them around and suddenly we saw the word Chewbode.
Yeah.
And we died laughing for some reason. Like, what does that even mean? It's just funny. It fits you.
Chewing bode. And we explicitly dropped the L, I think is the letter that was there. Forget this L. Let's just go with Chewbode. That sounds really funny.
Yeah. And we just laughed about it really hard and it stuck forever. And at that same time, on the graph paper, there was something you shared with me that really blew me away and it impressed me probably more than anything right away. I was like, this guy has really got something going on. This is something I have never experienced here before. Not to build it up too much, but being a 15-year-old kid who was pretty sheltered and seeing this scheme you came up with on the graph paper and explaining to me this concept, you and some friends of yours decided to make something called Brimstone the Uncanny Vigilante. Can you tell the story of what this thing was?
Yeah. The brief explanation is it was a video game. And it was inspired back in the day. There was a video game you could go into the arcades and play that was revolutionary for the time. The game was called Dragon's Lair. The ground-shattering thing about it is that where you would go to a game like Pac-Man and it's just these little dots moving around the screen with these really primitive sounds, Dragon's Lair actually inside of it was a giant DVD, basically. They called them Laserdiscs at the time. And it was an entire animated movie, like a Saturday morning cartoon with perfect resolution. It was like a medieval knight trying to save a princess. He's jumping all around doing these things. And for a split second, you'd see something flash on the side of the screen, and that was your indication to move the joystick in that direction or hit the jump button or something like that. So it was an interactive game, but you were kind of reacting to prompts. And that game eventually got released for home computers. It was very impressive quality. It wasn't full-blown Saturday morning, you're watching a television show quality at that point. It was, of course, scanned in images, and it was digitized, as they say at the time, brought into the computer.
But I mean, to me, when I saw it as a kid, when I saw Dragon's Lair, I was like, that's a TV show,
Absolutely.
Video game.
Yeah.
There was no difference to me.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, so there was a dummying down of it that made it way more realistic to be able to achieve that if you just knew some stuff about how computers worked. And we kind of did. There was those kinds of things where I would think about, I know a guy that knows audio and he's into music and stuff and he knows kind of how to do some stuff. And I know this guy who's an artist and he can draw like really amazing, like almost Marvel Comics level stuff. And so we started talking about putting together our version of Dragon's Lair for the PCs. And that was Brimstone. And it was essentially kind of like The Punisher, if you're familiar with those comics, where it's just this guy with guns running around kind of a Die Hard-esque kind of building where he's going through all these levels, trying to do things and ultimately, saving the day at the end. And that's basically the gist of the game.
Now, what blew me away about this, I didn't see any visuals at first. You just pulled out your graph paper and you showed me these spreadsheets you made of all of the detailed breakdowns. Like they were just handwritten paper Excel sheets, basically.
Yeah.
What spreadsheets were before we had computerized spreadsheets, I guess.
Yeah.
These tables. And you had calculated all the cost per item, all the production costs, the whole budgets, how much the envelopes would cost to ship them in, how much profit, what percentage of everything. And it was basically like a QuickBooks.
Yeah.
Like full breakdown, production breakdown. Yeah, and so here at the bottom line is basically on the low end, we're going to make this many millions of dollars. And on this end, we'll probably make more millions of dollars. And if you join in on this with us and do the music for it, this will be your share of it. And this is the budget we have for the... And I'm just like, this guy is really in another world.
It's out of his mind.
This is incredible. No, not. I was really impressed. I didn't doubt you one bit. I was like, this guy is smart. I don't know what I'm doing, but he knows what he's doing. He's got a plan, and I should stick with this guy and whatever he's doing because he's going somewhere. It's really funny to me looking back now because I was completely unequipped at that time to do any type of scoring or music. I knew nothing about what I was doing. Like I could play guitar pretty well, but I was a 15-year-old kid that was like, I barely know how to play through an amp. So it was funny that you were still including me on this thing.
Yeah, but that didn't matter at the time, right? Because that's the whole thing was, and again, that's the reflection of Image Comics or Industrial Light Magic. Like those people didn't know what they were doing originally either, and they made it happen.
But what's funny is that the rest of you guys really had proven skills that you could have potentially done something like that. And I just want to say that I was just not experienced or developed at that point. Compared to you guys, I was like, this is real stuff happening.
Like a little
here.
splash of cold water on your face.
Yeah.
Like, whoa.
And the next thing you showed me was I went over to your house and you showed me a short trailer, like a little teaser. And I don't think it had any of the characters in it or anything.
No.
But it was basically some computerized music, I think, some 8-bit music or something.
Yeah, some temporary stuff.
Amiga mods or something. You had really pro-looking company logos. Each of our little group of friends, like one of our friends, Mike, had this other... He had a company,
quote unquote,
that you made up, and you had a company name that you made up. There was Ground Zero Software and Hypertask Industries, and I just remember being so blown away that you took, like in a good way, that you took this seriously. You're like, these guys are making something over here on the other side of the creek.
Yep,
like this is incredible.
The other side of the horseshoe.
I just have to get past the alligators and get over there and like be a part of this somehow. This is really cool. How did you go about, do you recall how you even made that trailer? Because it was all bitmaps and stuff. You had to sit there. How did you go about programming a logo into a computer at that time?
You know, you mentioned earlier that I like microcosms of things. And one of the other types of things that I really enjoyed, once again, another discipline of computers, was graphics. And back in the days, it was all very primitive. You had very primitive tools. You could only have just so many colors on the computer screen at a given time. So you had to choose your palette of colors and got stuck with it, etc.
For instance, how many, like 8 colors or something, 16 colors?
I think it was 16 colors, and it was, 320 pixels by 240 pixels or something. It was really like postage stamp size stuff.
Maybe even smaller than what my Apple Watch is, maybe?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, like you would probably run that demo on your watch now and you couldn't see it. It's so small. I had done a few things where, again, I'd find these video games and I'd type them into the computer, years prior. And part of that was you had to import like a little graphics library so that the little Mario kind of character was bouncing around to, your input. And I figured out how to kind of crack into those files and mess around with them. And I started learning the tricks of like such low resolution looks really blocky. But like, you start doing this routine called anti-aliasing where you put, if it's a white circle on screen, it looks like a very chunky white circle. But if you put gray dots around there, it almost makes it a little fuzzy, but blends it into the background that's black. And now you get a smoother looking circle. Any of you gamers out there know this because modern graphics cards kind of just do this in your games automatically. Back then, you had to do it all by hand for every frame of animation you did. I learned that because those graphics used to bother the crap out of me. They just looked so chunky and like, why wouldn't you make it look nicer? And so I would bring that stuff in and I'd touch it up and the graphics would look better for that game out of the magazine. Well, fast forward, I had to have that quality now from this point forward. So anything I did, make it look good in this kind of, in this kind of fashion of smoothing out things, etc. So when it came down to doing something like the Brimstone intro or splash screen and logos and stuff, that was legitimately like coming up on paper with ideas, thinking, oh, this is really cool looking. Ground Zero Software was the word ground, the word zero split apart with like a glass mushroom cloud in between, and then it said software across the bottom. That's the ultimate end product of it. But I went through like 10, 20 revisions of how I wanted that to look on, and one point it was gold colored, one point it was glass colored and stuff. So I eventually just drew that in the computer by hand.
How do you draw that in the computer by hand?
Well, yeah, it's literally
because
like you think.
When I did stuff like that, I remember there might have been better tools by the point you were doing this, but when I had to do this on the TRS-80, it meant entering in coordinates like
it wasn't quite that bad.
000, comma 005 would put a block,
right,
1 pixel.
Yeah.
So you were using like maybe a paintbrush, like a bitmap, and clicking the dots.
Yeah, well, the TRS-80 didn't have a mouse for input. This is in the days where the Macs and Amigas and stuff, they had a mouse, so it was pretty easy to just grab the mouse, click the mouse button, and start drawing on the screen. That was a pretty standard thing, and there was a lot of art packages out there that allowed you to do that kind of stuff. Again, primitive compared to today with the tool set, but the concept was the same. And so, yeah, I would go into those. And I would start meticulously recreating the logo. And I would create the logo in its full color form. And the trailer that you ultimately saw was very basic, where I took those bitmaps of Ground Zero Software and Hypertask Industries and the ultimate end of the thing where it's Brimstone's logo. Just saved them as 3 files, right?
Yeah.
And then I brought them into I wrote a piece of software that basically, when you launch the software, it blackens out the screen.
Yeah, so you've got all these cool fading effects and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's all it was. It was basically just digitally adjusting the brightness of the screen, to make it, to trick your mind into think you're watching the trailer of a movie or something.
It's just incredible to me that back then, to do this sort of thing, you had to really want to do it and do it intentionally and figure out, it could take you an hour to do one transition or something.
Oh, yeah. It took forever to do that stuff back
now
then.
we just do it on Premiere and hit a button and it does it.
Right.
It's like
drop shadow, no problem. Yeah.
I think the realization back then was my 16-year-old friend Chewbode, sitting next to me here on the bus, is honestly capable of making something that I would see in a video game arcade. And I thought, oh man, someone knows how to get out of this place. There's actually a way out. This video game, Brimstone or whatever, might get us out of here. And you were inviting me to be a part of all of that. But at the time, when I was like 15, I was such a chaotic kid. I was pretty sheltered, and I think I was much more sheltered than other kids my age. I mostly stayed near the house or inside, kind of reading D&D books, and so I was never out really. I never got into any trouble, and I wasn't doing the things that other teenage kids did, like dating or learning to drive or socializing or getting part-time jobs or whatever like 15, 16-year-olds were doing. When you first started coming over to my place, it was, my bedroom was a disaster of, cables everywhere, cassette tapes outside of their cases, not rewound, pretzel crumbs everywhere.
Milk crates full of cables.
Milk crates full of old broken cables that don't do anything, just stacked up everywhere. I had boxes and boxes of cassettes because my mom would buy me cassettes to use in the 4-track to record whatever, and I never labeled any of them, and they'd end up just all over the place. It was chaos. You came in there and you actually introduced me to the idea, the concept of organization.
Which sounds silly now.
Yeah.
Really, but yeah.
It just somehow that was not a part of my upbringing. Like nobody taught me to do that, but I picked it up from you. I was like, he's coming in here and for some reason he's like straightening up the room. Like he'd like pick things up off the floor and he'd like, Chewbode would look at me and be like, "Oh, I can't." It's just like this. "Oh, I can't. I can't do that."
It pained me.
Yeah. And so, I had a cassette player stereo system kind of set up with wiring all over the place, and we would be sitting there doing something like playing on your computer or whatever was going on. And throughout the entire time that you were there, you had like a box of unwound tapes and cases. And you would sit there and process them rewind all the tapes.
It was like a background task.
Yeah, a background task, totally. You'd be doing that in the background while we were watching TV or whatever. you'd be sitting there, you'd rewind every tape, put it in its case, and then put them in order and like put them in the case or whatever, in the container.
So you could read they'd be set up so you could read the edge of it so you'd know what album it was or whatever was recorded on it or whatever.
And I just thought that was crazy at the time. I was like, why would someone do that? There's something kind of wrong with him in a way. Like I didn't know that was a good thing to do. It's funny to think that concept of organization didn't really enter my mind. Like all through school, I never got the hang of having a neat and tidy desk or notebook or anything like that. It was just a mess all over the place.
And I think it was just something that maybe you just didn't need in your life. It was just one of those things where at the time you didn't need to be organized for whatever reason. Your mind just didn't work that way, and it was fine, and it didn't cause you any harm being that way.
But it did, because I constantly lost everything. I was never able to do my schoolwork because I'd lose my books or lose my homework or not remember that I had homework.
I'm glad I came over then.
Yeah. Chris Higgins kind of described this concept as like a goldfish not knowing that it's wet or something. Like I just didn't know that I was chaotic. I thought that this was normal.
Right.
Why did you want to, as an outsider coming into that, what was that like for you? And why would you want to put my stuff in order? And do you get sort of a satisfaction or good feeling from things being in order?
Yeah, it's funny. Well, I did it because you let me do it, first of all. So from that perspective, I got away with it. I wouldn't call it like an OCD kind of thing, but I do have a mental structure that I think stems from being so young and playing around with computers and learning how computers work. During the phase of being very young and learning how to program, some of that included, like I said, learning the guts of the computers. And everything has its place, right? There's a reason that it does this stuff, and it's all organized in a very certain way, and there's hierarchies of how things function and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, a program will crash if it's out of order. The web page won't load if there's a single syntax error in the middle of it.
Yeah, and even more importantly, there's certain things where there's dependencies. It's like, if the computer starts up and the video card has died overnight, it'll tell you, hey, I can't function because I depend on this so you can see what's going on, right? And that goes to the nth degree in a computer. So naturally, my mind just kind of gets formed in that way. And I think at one point, you and I, years and years ago, were talking about all this. And I made a comment that kind of melted your brain a little bit. And I was like, yeah, my daily life is, I think, in folders and files. I mean, I don't physically see it like floating in front of me, but my brain processes things like a folder on a computer, like name the folder Excel spreadsheets, and all the Excel spreadsheets go in there and they're nicely tucked away and organized. And then maybe subfolders organizing it further into different departments, spreadsheets and stuff. That's basically how my mind has been, just because I kind of had to be that way, but also I enjoy being that way. It helps me keep a clearer mind. So that said, that's kind of the beginning of it. And then fast forward, when I encounter things that aren't like that, it kind of bothers me. It's like, there's better ways to do this. With you, when I started coming over and seeing this, it didn't really affect me like super immediately. It was first kind of scanning the horizon and being like, wow, there's a lot of boxes over there with, I don't know what's going on in there. And as we became friends and I was able to dig through these things literally more and more, I realized, these are just a bunch of guitar cables. Like, why when he goes to grab a guitar cable, he pulls it out and the whole 45 cable bunch comes out. It's like, why would you not just spend the time to wind them up properly and put, Velcro around them or something like that, so it's very easy to retrieve? Again, the cassette tapes, why would you risk damaging the stuff you're recording because you're throwing it in a bin and the tape kind of half comes out and it's getting crinkled? Like, just rewind it into its safe spot, man. Put it into the happy zone so it won't get damaged there, and it's clean and you know where you're at and all this. And this is just, again, me filing stuff away. So when I walk into this environment, eventually I get to a point where I start testing the waters and start doing this. My own life is not really super chaotic, and I have things very organized in my own life. So I'm helping my buddy out. And if he gets PO'd at me, then I'll stop doing it. But if he lets me do it, I'll do it, and hopefully it'll help him. Fast forward 2 weeks later, I come back and the tapes are all unwound again and the cables are stuffed into a crate again. So it became, kind of a joke, but
it became a joke because I'd be like,
not that you were doing,
can you come over and rewind the tapes?
But you weren't doing it on purpose. Like, you weren't trying to.
No.
Yeah.
It's interesting putting all of this in perspective for me and thinking back. I feel like any amount of linear thinking and organization in my life came from that time where you introduced me to that idea. And it took me, at least 15 to 20 years of slowly becoming more and more linear. And it's funny now to consider how much my life as an adult, I don't remember how old I am. I'm like 47, 48, something like that.
Something like that.
My wife always has to remind me how old I am. It's funny how central and how heavily weighted towards rigidity my life is on a daily basis. Because of that training of being whipped into shape by you, of like, don't leave that cable laying there. What are you doing? Wind that up.
Yeah.
It was sort of like seeking parental values in my certain friends. Mm-hmm. And in that way, you taught me how to be an organized adult.
Right.
But it took me 20 years of slowly. And to this day, it's funny, if I have a mess of tangled cables, which I have sometimes, I will have to take a photo and send it to you. Yes. And instantly you're just like, oh, don't send me that. What are you doing?
Well, we live on the opposite sides of the country. So I'll sometimes reply, I'm on a plane tomorrow. I'll be there soon,
Yeah. But it's funny how dramatically that impacted me.
Yeah.
And it came from you, Chewbode. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And I noticed it over the years. As time went on, I was watching you get more and more organized. And obviously you moved out from Florida to the West Coast. And so we didn't spend a lot of interpersonal time together. It was, via the phone, or sometimes we'd see each other in person when we flew to the other side of the country. But, we weren't in each other's stuff all the time as years went on. And so when I'd see you do something and get super organized about something, I'd be like, oh, is this something that like is a remnant of something I hopefully helped him with, or is he learning this from other people now too? He's just absorbing that.
It totally comes from Chewbode.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah. And I want to ask you also, related to this, I've always seen you as a shockingly split personality in a way, that you have these different personas. You have a very logical Spock Vulcan type side, which we're talking about with all of the organizing. But then you also, people who know you, a lot of people would really know you as this comedic madman, this total absurd, outrageous creativity. Once you have all of that other stuff locked down, when you have everything in place, you kind of go the complete opposite way with your imagination. Mm-hmm. You're very, very funny. You're very random. You have a vivid description of bizarre, twisted, surreal, sick ideas, perverted ideas. Do you have any thoughts on that duality? Like, what's going on there? How are you so one way and so the other? And do you feel like there's a division between the two, or do they blend together? Do you feel like maybe you need to be one more than the other, or do you feel balanced?
I can't really pinpoint or put a finger on exactly where that stemmed from. If I was to guess, this is a strangely natural evolution of being the technical mind, again, pointing back to learning computers at an early age, really getting into a position where I focused on that. I mean, I just want to enunciate this briefly, and I hate to keep kind of stopping and starting like this, but when I was doing that stuff as a kid, I would go on 18-hour programming benders. I would sit there with a soda or a high C or whatever was in fashion at the time, depending on my age. I'd sit at the computer and I'd bang out code, and I'd have such a great time. And the majority of the time, it was just all for me. Like, I wasn't necessarily taking some crazy programming and send it to you and be like, look what I made necessarily, or whatever. I was having a ton of fun, and I was learning a lot of what at the time felt like really like groundbreaking things that like no one thinks of this stuff, but obviously they probably were, but that was just my own bubble, right? And I was just really enthralled by that. So you got this real technical mind doing all this stuff, but at the same time, like, I wanted to play the video game. I wanted to do the graphics, which is inherently kind of a creative process. Like I said, I tried to kind of get into some musical type things and just kind of crash and burn. And so, okay, that's not me, but I can go back to the graphic stuff. So I've always kind of had this technical and creative piece. And I think as time has gone on and as I grew up, there's been phases in my life where one side or the other has been turned on or off, right? And I think, I mentioned a minute ago that I got to a point where I had a day job and I was doing kind of boring programming stuff. So being able to come home and call you up, or if you were still, living near me at the time, we hang out and we talk about a project, is just like the creativity explodes again, right?
Yeah, because you're, on a daily basis, you're considered a very serious IT dude who's responsible for large amounts of money and technology.
Yeah.
And it's not always good for everybody to know that you're Chewbode.
Psycho.
Yeah. Like letting that side of yourself out
Right,
necessarily isn't always the best thing.
Well, and there's stages too. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to say I don't want to give the impression I'm a Jekyll or Hyde kind of scenario.
Right.
But like, if I know you and you're a friend of mine and you're kind of in that inner circle, there's even a reservation. Like I'll be the jokey guy that
Yes.
does weird things and stick pretzels to the wall to see who laughs, right?
Yeah.
It's almost a performance. Like who can I make laugh in the room, right?
Yeah, and it's a good way of like breaking the ice with people.
Right. But people like Carl, who I've, kind of known my whole life and we've done so much together and we've been involved working very closely physically in a room, sometimes silently for hours at a time to accomplish a goal or whatever, or traipsing around, South Venice trying to do some project or whatever. Like you get to that point where you just inherently start, doing gross jokes with your buddy and there's that level where I've got, a few of the guys that I can be that way with and I can just say outlandish stuff. And actually, as a matter of fact,
Like buying the cupcakes, which we won't get into, but that's a phenomenon.
yeah. Well, and it even got so to a point where, and I won't go too elaborate into this, but there was actually a time where I considered taking my, company name that we were kind of doing our projects under for a while, and I was going to switch it to call it the Perverted Mime Factory, and because there was a whole stint of weird things that like I would do from time to time.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's I had completely forgotten this now, probably for a year. I haven't even thought about this, but you used to do perverted miming.
Yeah.
And you were really good at it.
To be clear, not as a profession.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was more of a just, as we were hanging out, buddies, I would just like do something funny and we'd all laugh about it or whatever.
Just very, very realistic motions with certain body parts that were invisible that he was imagining, and having those body parts react with physical space and have real-time reactions with physics.
And silently standing
wow.
there and pretending to like have walls around you, like miming it, like
But
pretending to
very
be a
perverted.
mime. But very perverted, yeah.
And so I just want to kind of, if you're done talking about that topic, I just want to cap that off and say, you are a person who is extreme in both of those directions.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
You don't see that very often. Someone who is that far, that logical, and also that surreal.
Yeah. And again, just in my cap off of that is there's the structured part, the technical part, there's the creative part. And then I happen to also have this extreme gross out thing that I do just as who can I shock in the room?
Yeah.
And I find that really funny to see people like gasp when I do something silly or whatever.
Let's talk about Venice High School, where we met and we attended. It seems to me that the educational system at Venice High School, or in Florida in general, did not work for either of us. Mm-hmm. We were smart kids.
Yep.
And I know that at least in 4th and 5th grade, I was considered gifted. I don't know what happened by the time I got to high school, but I'm assuming you were also considered gifted in some way. I don't know if that was ever officially said to you, but why didn't we seem to be able to follow the program? You told me that you wouldn't do homework. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a political statement or anything. It's not like I was trying to prove some point. I mentioned that my credit hours got really messed up when I moved to Florida. I tried a little bit, then kind of got disillusioned with the fact that things just weren't going to stack up in the way I kind of thought about. And
well, I mean, was this when you wanted to be a surgeon?
Yeah.
So you wanted to be a surgeon.
A brain surgeon.
Yeah. And you ended up living next to a creek in South Venice.
Next to a broken alligator bridge.
Next to a broken alligator bridge. That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that's the end of part 1 of my chat with Chewbode. In part 2, we'll find out the answer to why we just couldn't seem to succeed in the educational system that was Venice High School. Okay, that's the end of this episode of The Carl King Show. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you consume these dang episodes. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the special illusionist level, Chewbode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for joining me. And as Chewbode always says, rabble dabble.